The morning sun barely penetrated the grimy windows of Courtroom 7 as Maya Thompson straightened her blazer and prepared to face another day of legal battles. As a member of parliament representing the Riverside district, she'd seen her share of conflicts, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. The air conditioning wheezed overhead, struggling against the oppressive heat that seemed to mirror the tension building in the packed gallery. Reporters clutched their notebooks, community activists whispered anxiously among themselves, and police officers lined the walls with crossed arms and stern expressions. Maya was there representing her constituent, 17-year-old Marcus Williams, who sat trembling at the defendant's table. The charges against him were ridiculous, resisting arrest and assaulting an officer, when everyone with eyes knew the truth. 3 videos from different angles showed Marcus doing nothing but asking why he was being stopped. But the system had a way of twisting reality, and today Maya was determined to untwist it. She'd spent weeks preparing for this preliminary hearing, gathering evidence, coaching witnesses, and building an ironclad defense. Her reputation as a fierce advocate had earned her enemies in the police department, but it had also given hope to countless families who'd lost faith in justice. Officer Derek Brennan stood near the prosecution table, his neck thick as a tree trunk, his uniform starched to military precision. He was the arresting officer, a 15-year veteran with a record that Maya had meticulously researched. 23 excessive force complaints. 16 dismissed. 7 settled quietly with taxpayer money. 0 convictions. He represented everything wrong with the system, and he knew Maya had come armed with documentation to prove it. His eyes tracked her movements with barely concealed contempt, his jaw working like he was chewing on nails. The other officers in the room seemed to orbit around him, taking cues from his aggressive posture. When the judge called for a recess to review evidence, Maya approached the defense table to comfort Marcus's mother, who was sobbing quietly into her hands. She placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder, whispering reassurances that rang hollow even to her own ears. The justice system moved like a glacier, cold and crushing, and promises felt like bandages on bullet wounds. Marcus looked up at her with eyes that had aged decades in mere months, and Maya felt the familiar fire of righteous anger burning in her chest. This was why she'd entered politics. This was why she fought. As she turned to gather her briefcase, Officer Brennan stepped directly into her path. The movement was deliberate, confrontational, designed to intimidate. Maya had dealt with bullies her entire life, in schoolyards, in boardrooms, in the halls of Parliament itself, and she recognized the game. He stood close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough to violate the boundaries of professional space. His badge glinted under the fluorescent lights like a warning. Behind him, 2 other officers shifted their weight, hands resting casually near their belts. The message was clear: we outnumber you, we outgun you, and you're in our house. Maya met his gaze without flinching. She was 5'6" to his 6'3", but she'd never measured power in inches. Her grandmother had taught her that strength came from knowing who you were and refusing to apologize for it. She'd carried that lesson from the projects where she grew up, through law school where professors assumed she was the cleaning lady, and into Parliament where colleagues dismissed her as a diversity hire. Every insult had been fuel. Every obstacle had been training. And now, standing in this courthouse with Marcus's future hanging in the balance, Maya Thompson was done backing down. Officer Brennan leaned in, his voice a low growl meant only for her ears. The words dripped with venom, with years of accumulated resentment toward people who dared to question authority. He questioned her credentials, her motives, her right to be there. The insults were calculated, chosen for maximum damage, designed to provoke a reaction that would undermine her credibility. Maya's hands tightened around her briefcase handle, her knuckles paling. She opened her mouth to respond with the cutting eloquence that had made her famous in parliamentary debates, but before a single word could escape, Officer Brennan's hand flashed upward. The slap echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, silencing every conversation, freezing every movement. Maya's head snapped to the side, her cheek blooming red with the perfect imprint of his palm. For one suspended moment, the world held its breath. Time seemed to fracture into slow motion as Maya's vision blurred with tears that came not from pain but from pure, incandescent rage. The physical sting of the slap was nothing compared to the assault on her dignity, her position, her humanity. She'd been threatened before, harassed, even followed home by angry constituents, but never had someone dared to lay hands on her in broad daylight, in a court of law, surrounded by witnesses. The audacity was staggering. The disrespect was calculated. And in that crystallized moment of clarity, Maya understood that this wasn't just about her. This was about every black woman who'd ever been told to sit down and shut up, every activist who'd been brutalized for speaking truth to power, every child like Marcus who'd learned too young that the system wasn't built to protect them. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Gasps echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Marcus's mother screamed. Reporters surged forward, cameras appearing from nowhere like magic. The judge, who'd been reviewing documents in her chambers, came rushing back through the doorway, her black robe billowing behind her like storm clouds. But Maya barely registered any of it. Her entire focus had narrowed to the man standing before her, this uniformed bully who just made the worst mistake of his career. Officer Brennan's face showed a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty, as if even he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by his default expression of arrogant authority. He squared his shoulders, preparing to paint himself as the victim, to claim she'd provoked him, to activate the brotherhood that always protected their own. Maya's training kicked in before conscious thought could interfere. Most people didn't know that before law school, before Parliament, she'd spent 6 years studying mixed martial arts. It had started as self-defense classes at the community center, a way to feel safe walking home through dangerous neighborhoods. But it had become something more, a discipline, a meditation, a way of channeling all the anger and frustration into something controlled and powerful. Her instructor, an elderly Korean woman named Master Kim, had taught her that true strength wasn't about aggression. It was about balance, timing, and making your opponent's force work against them. Maya had earned her black belt 3 years ago, training in the early mornings before parliamentary sessions, maintaining the practice even as her political career demanded more time. She'd never imagined she'd need to use those skills like this. Her body moved with muscle memory, executing a combination she'd practiced 10,000 times in the dojo. First, a deflection, her left hand swept up to guard against any follow-up strike. Then, a pivot, her right foot stepped back into the side, creating the perfect angle. Officer Brennan was big and strong, but size meant nothing without technique. Maya's right hand shot forward in a precise strike to his solar plexus, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but enough to force the air from his lungs and double him over. As he bent forward, gasping, Maya's left hand came up in a controlled palm strike to his jaw. The angle was perfect, the force was measured, and the result was inevitable. Officer Brennan's eyes rolled back, his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Silence crashed over the courtroom like a tsunami. Every person stood frozen, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. A member of parliament had just knocked out a police officer in the middle of a courthouse. The implications were staggering, the potential consequences catastrophic. Maya's career could end right here, right now. Criminal charges would likely follow. The police union would demand prosecution. The media would have a field day. Political opponents would seize the opportunity to call her violent, dangerous, unfit for office. Every fear raced through her mind in the span of a heartbeat, but underneath it all was something unexpected, a sense of absolute rightness. She'd been pushed her entire life, told to take it, to turn the other cheek, to be twice as good for half the recognition. And in that moment, watching Officer Brennan lying unconscious on the courtroom floor, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The judge's gavel slammed down repeatedly, the sharp cracks finally breaking the spell. Security guards rushed forward, their hands reaching for Maya, but the judge's voice cut through the confusion like a blade. She ordered everyone to stop, to freeze, to let her think. Maya didn't resist as guards positioned themselves on either side of her. She kept her hands visible, her posture non-threatening, her breathing controlled. Master Kim's voice echoed in her head, "After the storm, comes the calm." Marcus's mother was crying openly now, torn between horror and something that looked almost like pride. The reporters were frantically typing, already composing headlines that would dominate the news cycle for weeks. And Officer Brennan remained motionless on the floor, a paramedic rushing over to check his vital signs while his fellow officers looked on with expressions ranging from shock to barely suppressed fury. The world had shifted on its axis, and there was no going back. Within minutes, the courthouse transformed into the epicenter of a national crisis. Police cruisers surrounded the building, their lights painting the walls in alternating red and blue. News helicopters circled overhead like vultures sensing blood. Inside courtroom 7, Maya stood with her wrists in handcuffs, not because she'd resisted or tried to flee, but because protocol demanded it. The metal bit into her skin, cold and unforgiving, but she kept her head high and her expression calm. She'd known this moment might come, had perhaps always known that standing up to power carried a price. The question was whether that price would be worth paying. Around her, the machinery of the justice system kicked into overdrive, trying to contain a situation that was already spiraling beyond anyone's control. Officer Brennan had regained consciousness, though he remained groggy and disoriented. Paramedics had checked him for concussion, found no serious injuries, and recommended he be taken to the hospital for observation. He'd refused, instead insisting on pressing charges immediately. His fellow officers surrounded him like a protective wall, their anger palpable and dangerous. Maya could hear them muttering about assaulting an officer, about making an example, about teaching this politician a lesson she'd never forget. The union representative was already on his way, and Maya knew what that meant. They would marshal every resource, call in every favor, and use the full weight of the system to crush her. It was the oldest story in the world, the powerful punishing those who dared to fight back. But something unexpected was happening outside the courthouse. Word had spread faster than wildfire through social media. The hashtag #JusticeForMaya was already trending nationwide. Videos from inside the courtroom, captured on phones that security should have confiscated, were being shared millions of times. The footage was crystal clear. Officer Brennan stepping into Maya's path, the aggressive posture, the verbal confrontation, and most importantly, the slap that started everything. Context mattered, and the internet had delivered it in stunning high definition. Within an hour, Maya's name was being chanted by crowds gathering outside. Community leaders who'd worked with her for years were calling for her immediate release. Civil rights organizations were preparing statements. And the narrative that the police department had hoped to control was slipping through their fingers like water. Inside the courthouse, the district attorney faced an impossible decision. Valerie Chen was a career prosecutor, someone who'd built her reputation on being tough but fair. She'd worked with Maya on several community initiatives and respected her commitment to justice. But she also understood the political realities. If she didn't charge Maya with assault, the police union would revolt. If she did charge her, she'd face accusations of racism and protecting corrupt cops. There was no good option, only degrees of bad. Valerie stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls from the mayor, the police chief, the governor's office. Everyone wanted her to make this problem disappear, but you couldn't make truth disappear. The slap had happened. The knockout had happened. And now the whole world was watching. Marcus Williams sat in the corner of the courtroom, forgotten in all the chaos. His preliminary hearing had been postponed indefinitely, his case suddenly the least important thing happening in the building. But he couldn't take his eyes off Maya, who was being led toward a holding cell. She'd risked everything for him, a kid she barely knew, because she believed he deserved better. Marcus had spent months feeling powerless, convinced that the system would grind him up and spit him out regardless of his innocence. But watching Maya Thompson refuse to back down, refuse to accept abuse, refuse to play by rules that were designed to keep people like them in their place, something shifted inside him. Fear began to transform into something else. Anger crystallized into determination. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would never forget what he'd witnessed today. The judge called for an emergency hearing to address the incident. Magistrate Linda Hoffman was 63 years old, a woman who'd spent 4 decades navigating the treacherous waters of the legal system. She'd seen police misconduct before, had witnessed prosecutorial overreach, had watched as the machinery of justice sometimes produced injustice instead. This case put her in an impossible position, but she'd taken an oath that meant something to her. In her chambers, she reviewed the video footage that had already leaked online. She watched Officer Brennan slap Maya Thompson without provocation. She watched Maya's immediate, controlled response. And she watched a police officer learn that badges didn't grant immunity from consequences. When she returned to the courtroom an hour later, her decision was made. The room fell silent as she prepared to speak, understanding that whatever she said next would reverberate far beyond these walls. Maya stood straight despite the handcuffs, meeting the judge's eyes with quiet dignity. This was the moment that would define not just her future, but the message sent about power, privilege, and who had the right to defend themselves. Judge Hoffman's voice cut through the tension like a razor. She began by addressing the obvious, that what had transpired in her courtroom was unprecedented, unacceptable, and demanded immediate action. But as she continued speaking, it became clear that her understanding of unacceptable included more than just Maya's actions. She detailed what the video footage showed, narrating it for the official record with clinical precision. Officer Brennan approaching Member of Parliament Thompson aggressively. The verbal confrontation. The slap that constituted assault and battery. And then she did something that sent shockwaves through the assembled police officers. She ordered Officer Brennan taken into custody for assault on a government official. The courtroom exploded. Officers shouted objections. Brennan's face turned purple with rage. But the judge's gavel crashed down repeatedly until order was restored. However, Judge Hoffman wasn't finished. She acknowledged that Maya had responded with physical force that, while arguably defensive, exceeded what might be considered proportional response. The law didn't allow for retaliatory strikes, even against someone who'd committed assault first. Maya would face charges of simple assault, but given the circumstances, the judge was releasing her on her own recognizance pending trial. The handcuffs came off, and Maya rubbed her wrists, processing the judge's Solomon-like decision. Both she and Brennan would face the system they'd both served in different capacities. The judge was refusing to play favorites, but she was also refusing to ignore context. It was the kind of judicial courage that was increasingly rare, and Maya felt a grudging respect despite her uncertain future. The media circus outside had grown to biblical proportions. Every major network had dispatched their top reporters. Cable news was wall-to-wall coverage, with panels of experts debating use of force, self-defense laws, and the broader implications of a member of parliament striking a police officer. Opinion was sharply divided along predictable lines. Some saw Maya as a hero who'd finally struck back against police brutality. Others saw her as a dangerous vigilante who'd attacked a law enforcement officer doing his job. The nuance, that both could have acted wrongly, that systems could be broken even when individuals tried to work within them, was lost in the rush to choose sides. Social media became a battleground, with doxing and death threats flowing in both directions. The country's existing fractures widened into chasms. Maya's legal team assembled rapidly. Civil rights attorneys who'd been fighting police misconduct for decades offered their services pro bono. They understood that this case could set precedents, could change how self-defense was understood when dealing with law enforcement. But they also warned Maya that the road ahead would be brutal. The police union was already calling for the maximum possible sentence. Politicians who'd once courted her endorsement were suddenly unreachable. Some of her fellow MPs publicly supported her, but many remained silent, calculating the political costs of association. Maya sat in a borrowed office, reviewing the legal strategy, and felt the weight of representation pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who'd ever been told to accept abuse from those in power, to take it quietly, to know their place. Officer Brennan's perspective told a different story, one his union representatives were eager to share. They painted him as a dedicated officer who'd been provoked by an aggressive politician interfering with law enforcement. They claimed Maya had been verbally abusive, had threatened him, had created a hostile situation. The slap, they argued, was an instinctive reaction to perceived aggression, not a calculated assault. And her response, a trained fighter attacking an officer, was evidence of premeditation, of someone looking for an excuse to commit violence. They leaked selected parts of Maya's training records, spinning her martial arts background as evidence of dangerous tendencies. Conservative media outlets ran with this narrative, broadcasting segments about politicians who thought themselves above the law, who believed their positions granted them immunity from consequences. The story was carefully crafted, the victim and aggressor roles deliberately reversed. But the videos didn't lie, and more kept emerging. Someone had security footage from the hallway showing Officer Brennan following Maya earlier that morning, his body language aggressive and stalking. Another camera caught audio of him talking with fellow officers, using racial slurs and vowing to put that politician in her place. Each revelation undermined the carefully constructed narrative, but his defenders simply moved the goalposts, arguing that words weren't violence, that his personal views didn't affect his professional conduct, that officers had the right to dislike the people second-guessing their every move. The debate became less about what actually happened and more about competing visions of justice, authority, and who deserved protection under the law. Both sides dug in, fortifying positions that had been decades in the making. Meanwhile, Marcus Williams's case hung in limbo. His hearing had been postponed, lost in the chaos of the larger story. But his attorneys saw an opportunity. They filed motions to dismiss based on Officer Brennan's clear bias and misconduct. They argued that if the arresting officer was so compromised that he'd assault a member of parliament in open court, how could any of his testimony or arrest reports be trusted? The prosecution fought back, claiming that Brennan's actions in the courtroom had no bearing on the validity of Marcus's arrest months earlier. But the public wasn't buying it. Protests that had started about Maya's arrest evolved into broader demonstrations about police accountability. Marcus became a symbol of all the young black men caught in a system rigged against them from birth. And as the legal battles played out in courtrooms, a larger battle for the soul of justice itself raged in streets and squares across the nation. 3 months later, both trials reached their conclusions within days of each other, as if the universe demanded symmetry. Officer Derek Brennan stood before a jury of his peers, facing assault and battery charges stemming from the slap that had been viewed hundreds of millions of times worldwide. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, video from multiple angles, testimony from dozens of witnesses, and Brennan's own history of complaints and violent behavior. His defense team tried to humanize him, bringing in his wife and children, showing his commendations and years of service. But the footage was inescapable, undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Brennan's face remained impassive as the judge sentenced him to 1 year in county jail, suspended after 6 months, 3 years probation, and permanent removal from law enforcement. His career was over. His pension was in jeopardy. The union protested, but their power to protect him had limits, especially when the evidence was this clear. Maya's trial was more complex. The prosecution acknowledged she'd been assaulted but argued that her response exceeded legal self-defense. They brought in use-of-force experts who testified that striking back wasn't necessary once the initial threat had passed. Maya's team countered with testimony about the reasonable fear of additional violence, about split-second decisions made in moments of crisis, about the particular vulnerability of black women facing aggressive police officers. They presented data on police violence, on cases where victims who didn't fight back were severely injured or killed, on the impossible calculation of how much resistance was acceptable when facing someone with a badge and a gun. The jury was more diverse than Brennan's, including several women of color who understood intimately the dynamics at play. After 2 days of deliberation, they returned a verdict of not guilty on all charges, citing justifiable self-defense. The courtroom erupted in cheers and tears. Maya collapsed into her attorney's arms, the weight of months of stress finally releasing. Outside, crowds celebrated, chanting her name and holding signs declaring victory. But Maya's emotions were more complicated than pure relief. She'd won her freedom, but the cost had been enormous. Her political career was damaged, perhaps permanently. Several colleagues had turned against her. Constituents who'd once loved her now questioned her judgment. And she knew that for every person celebrating, another was furious, convinced that she'd gotten away with assaulting a police officer through celebrity and privilege. The country remained divided, the underlying issues unresolved. One trial couldn't fix systemic problems decades in the making. Marcus Williams' charges were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be filed again. The judge ruled that Officer Brennan's credibility was so compromised that nothing from his arrest report could be trusted. Marcus stood outside the courthouse with his mother, tears streaming down both their faces as they hugged tightly. He'd been given his life back, a second chance that so many others never received. In interviews afterward, he spoke eloquently about justice, about the need for reform, about Maya Thompson's courage inspiring him to find his own voice. He enrolled in community college, planning to study criminal justice and work toward changing the system from within. One case, one kid saved, it wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was something real and precious. Maya held a press conference a week after her acquittal. She stood at a podium, flanked by community leaders and civil rights activists, her voice steady and clear. She spoke about the need for police accountability, for better training, for systems that protected citizens rather than shielding officers who abused their power. But she also acknowledged her own actions, accepting that violence wasn't the answer, that there had to be better ways to resist injustice. She announced she would be introducing comprehensive police reform legislation, using her experience to drive change rather than simply retreating from public life. Some criticized her for not apologizing more forcefully. Others praised her refusal to prostrate herself for defending her dignity. Maya listened to all of it, learned from all of it, and kept moving forward because that was the only direction that mattered. A year later, several things had changed. Maya's police reform bill passed the legislature, though in a watered-down version that disappointed advocates while still making incremental improvements. Officer Brennan served his sentence and was released, moving to another state and working in private security, his law enforcement career truly finished. Marcus Williams thrived in college, maintaining a perfect grade point average and becoming a youth advocate. The video of that day in Courtroom 7 became historical footage, studied in law schools and played in documentaries about criminal justice reform. Some saw it as a cautionary tale about violence begetting violence. Others saw it as a rare moment when the powerless fought back and won. Maya Thompson continued serving in Parliament, though she never quite regained her previous prominence. She was okay with that. The fire that had driven her to politics still burned, but it was tempered now by wisdom earned through consequence. She understood that real change was slow, that victories were often partial, that the work never truly ended. On quiet nights, she sometimes replayed that moment in the courtroom, wondering if she'd do it differently given another chance. The honest answer was she didn't know. She'd been pushed past breaking, had responded with instinct and training, and had faced the consequences head-on. Whether it was right or wrong depended on which lens you viewed it through, which values you prioritized, which version of justice you believed in. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would never stop fighting for people like Marcus, for communities crushed under the weight of systems designed to contain them rather than serve them. That slap had been meant to silence her, to remind her of her place in hierarchies built on power and intimidation. Instead, it had sparked something that couldn't be extinguished, a conversation about accountability, about dignity, about the right to defend yourself even when facing those who claimed authority. The story didn't have a neat ending because the struggle never did. It just continued, one day at a time, one case at a time, one person finding courage to stand up when everything told them to stay down. And in those moments, when ordinary people did extraordinary things, the world shifted just a little bit toward justice.